James Washington stood on the polished wooden porch of his newly acquired home, his deep brown eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and triumph as he surveyed the upscale neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. The sun blazed high in the sky on that sultry summer afternoon of July 2025, casting golden rays that danced across the surface of the backyard pool, transforming it into a glistening expanse of liquid sapphire. For James, this wasn't just a house, it was the culmination of 15 years of relentless dedication as a police officer, years marked by sleepless nights, perilous encounters, and meticulous savings from overtime shifts that left little room for a personal life. At 42, he was no longer the wide-eyed recruit who'd joined the force with grand notions of justice. He was a man seasoned by experience, his broad shoulders bearing the weight of countless stories etched into his memory like lines on a weathered map. The two-story house, with its crisp white exterior, expansive windows framed in dark trim, and a red-tiled roof that gleamed under the sun, stood as a monument to his perseverance. But it was the pool, the crystal-clear oasis nestled in the manicured backyard, that had sealed the deal when he'd first laid eyes on the property listing. It promised serenity, a place to unwind, and perhaps even a new chapter of community and connection. He leaned against the railing, his calloused fingers tracing the grain of the wood, and inhaled deeply. The air was thick with the warmth of the south, tinged with the faint sweetness of freshly mown grass and the distant hum of a lawnmower. James closed his eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush against his close-cropped hair, and imagined the life he'd built here. Weekend barbecues with old friends from the precinct, the sizzle of ribs on the grill mingling with laughter, the gentle splash of water as he floated in the pool after a long day, these were the scenes he'd envisioned when he'd signed the papers 3 weeks ago. His parents, long gone now, had never owned a home of their own, their lives confined to cramped apartments in Atlanta's tougher neighborhoods. They'd spoken of a house like this in reverent whispers, a distant dream for their son, and now James had made it real. At 6 feet 2 inches, with a solid build honed by years of training and a quiet confidence that came from facing down chaos, he felt ready to claim this piece. The neighborhood exuded affluence and order. Tree-lined streets stretched out before him, each home a showcase of architectural elegance, colonial revivals with sprawling porches, modern designs with sleek lines, and manicured lawns bordered by vibrant flower beds. The residents, from what he'd observed during his move-in, were a mix of professionals, retirees, and families, their polished SUVs and golf carts hinting at a comfortable, leisurely lifestyle. James had chosen Charlotte for its slower pace compared to Atlanta, where he'd spent his career dodging bullets and breaking up bar fights. Here, he hoped, life would be different. But as he stood there, savoring the moment, he couldn't shake a faint flicker of unease, a cop's intuition honed over years of reading people and situations. He brushed it off, chalking it up to the lingering adrenaline of the move. That flicker proved prophetic just days later. James was in the backyard, arranging a set of teak patio furniture he'd splurged on as a housewarming gift to himself, when he heard the unmistakable creak of his back gate. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and saw a woman striding confidently onto his property. She was middle-aged, perhaps in her early 50s, with meticulously styled blonde hair that fell in soft waves to her shoulders and a pair of oversized sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. She wore a designer swimsuit, black with gold accents, that hugged her frame, a luxurious towel draped over one arm, and a pair of flip-flops that slapped against the stone path with each step. Her posture radiated entitlement, as if the world bent to her whims, and she carried herself with the air of someone accustomed to getting her way. James set down the chair he'd been positioning and straightened, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me, can I help you?" he called out, keeping his tone neutral but firm, a habit from years of de-escalating tense encounters on the job. The woman stopped short, her lips curling into a tight smile as she lowered her sunglasses to appraise him. Her blue eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over him, from his faded t-shirt and cargo shorts to the beads of sweat glistening on his dark skin, before settling on his face. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with a faux sweetness that didn't reach her eyes, "I thought you were the pool maintenance guy. The previous owners always let me use this pool whenever I pleased. I figured I'd drop by to see if it's still in good shape." James felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, the kind he'd get when a suspect's story didn't add up. He'd dealt with enough people in his career to recognize the subtle jab beneath her words, the assumption that he couldn't possibly be more than hired help. He crossed his arms, his stance relaxed but unyielding. "I'm not the maintenance guy," he replied, his voice steady, carrying the weight of authority he'd earned over years on the force. "I'm the new owner of this house. And I'd appreciate it if you asked permission before coming onto my property." The woman, Linda Harris, as he'd later learn, tilted her head slightly, her smile faltering for a split second before returning, sharper this time, like a blade thinly veiled. She let out a short, breathy laugh, the sound grating against the quiet afternoon. "Owner, huh?" she murmured, her tone just low enough to feign innocence, though the implication hung heavy in the air. She adjusted the towel on her arm, her manicured nails glinting in the sunlight, and studied him again, as if trying to reconcile his presence with her expectations. "Well," she said at last, "that's unexpected. I know the realtor who handled this place, and she never mentioned." She trailed off, waving a hand vaguely in his direction, leaving the rest unsaid but painfully clear. James didn't flinch. He'd faced worse than veiled racism in his time, drunk drivers hurling slurs, suspects sizing him up with contempt, and he'd learned long ago to keep his cool. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "This is my home, and you're trespassing. Please leave." Linda's lips pursed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as if she were reassessing her strategy. For a moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching taut between them. Then she shrugged, a dismissive gesture that belied the flicker of irritation in her gaze. "Fine," she said, turning on her heel with a theatrical flourish. As she walked back toward the gate, her flip-flops echoing against the stone, she tossed a final remark over her shoulder, "We'll see who really belongs here." James watched her go, the gate swinging shut behind her with a soft thud. He stood there for a long minute, hands on his hips, staring at the spot where she'd disappeared. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking faintly as he processed the encounter. He knew her type, entitled, petty, and convinced the world owed her something. In his years as a cop, he'd met plenty like her, the ones who thought rules didn't apply to them, who wielded their privilege like a weapon. Back then, he'd had a badge and a protocol to lean on. Now, he was just a homeowner, but the instincts remained. Linda Harris wasn't going to let this go, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. He returned to his furniture, adjusting the chairs with a little more force than necessary, the clatter of wood against stone a small release for the frustration simmering in his chest. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, and James tried to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. He wanted to believe she'd back off, that she was just testing boundaries and would lose interest. But his gut told him otherwise. Linda's parting words weren't a casual quip, they were a promise, a declaration of intent. And James Washington, with his years of reading people and anticipating trouble, wasn't about to let his guard down. As he finished setting up the patio, the pool glimmered invitingly in the fading light, a silent promise of the peace he'd come here to find. He grabbed a cold soda from the cooler he'd brought outside, popped it open, and sank into one of the chairs, letting the fizz settle his nerves. The neighborhood was quiet now, save for the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog. He tipped his head back, staring up at the sky as it shifted from blue to hues of orange and pink, and made a silent vow. She left, her confidence unshaken, and James realized she wasn't just annoying, she was relentless. The breaking point came one afternoon when he returned from the grocery store, arms full of bags, to find Linda hosting a book club in his backyard. 8 women lounged by the pool, their wine glasses clinking, their voices a chorus of entitlement. The sight pushed him over the edge. He set the bags down, pulled out his phone, and dialed the police, his former colleagues at the Charlotte PD. Officers Brooks and Carter arrived within 20 minutes, their patrol car pulling up with a familiar screech. "James, long time no see," Brooks said, stepping out with a grin that faded as he took in the scene. "Oh, it's one of those calls." Linda leapt into action, tears welling up as she clutched her chest. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man's harassing us. We've always had pool privileges with the old owners, and he's being unreasonable." Carter, a wiry man with a no-nonsense demeanor, cut her off. "Ma'am, Mr. Washington was one of our best. If he says you're trespassing, you're trespassing. Leave now, or we'll make this official." The women scrambled to leave, their heels clicking against the stone, but Linda lingered, her face red with humiliation. "You'll regret this," she spat at James, storming out last. The officers stayed a moment longer, clapping James on the shoulder. "She's trouble," Brooks warned. "Watch your back." James nodded, thanking them as they left. He cleaned up the mess, spilled wine, crumpled napkins, a forgotten sandal floating in the pool, and sat heavily on the patio, staring at the water. Linda's campaign was intensifying, and he knew it wouldn't stop with tears and threats. That night, he reviewed the footage, adding it to his growing file. He wasn't just annoyed anymore, he was angry, a slow burn that fueled his next move. Her retaliation came swiftly. Posts appeared on the neighborhood Facebook group, anonymous, of course, about suspicious activity at his address. His morning paper vanished daily, caught on camera as Linda snatched it at dawn. Complaints about his unkempt yard flooded the HOA, despite his lawn being pristine. One evening, he found his fence streaked with red spray paint, the footage showing Linda's shadowy figure wielding the can under cover of darkness. She was relentless, a force of petty vengeance determined to drive him out. At the monthly HOA meeting, she played her trump card. The room buzzed with residents, their chatter dying down as Linda stood, her voice dripping with concern. "I'm worried about property values," she said, casting a pointed glance at James. "Some recent changes around here are making potential buyers uneasy." James rose, his phone in hand, his voice calm but firm. "Funny you mention property values, Linda. Care to explain this footage of you painting my fence last Tuesday at 11:47 p.m.? He played the video, the room falling silent as Linda's figure appeared on the screen, spray can in hand. Her face paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "I was checking for suspicious activity," she stammered. "Someone's been damaging properties." "Sure," James said, his tone dry. "And now we all know who." The room erupted in murmurs, eyes turning to Linda with newfound suspicion. She sat down, defeated for the moment, but James knew she wouldn't stop. That night, he found his pool water tainted again, this time with a sharp lemon scent that stung his eyes. He stood by the water's edge, the ripples mocking his fading peace, and a plan began to form. Linda wanted his pool. He'd give it to her, with a twist she'd never forget. He remembered a case from his police days, a non-toxic pool dye used to trace leaks, harmless but reactive with certain chemicals in high-end sunscreens and cosmetics. It faded after a week, leaving no damage, just embarrassment. It was perfect. He ordered the dye online, spending an evening in his garage testing it with a sample of Linda's favorite sunscreen he'd found abandoned on his chairs. The water turned a vivid green, bright and unmistakable, and he grinned for the first time in weeks. Through the neighborhood grapevine, Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street, who'd taken to chatting with him over her empanadas, he learned Linda was planning another pool party that weekend, a property values event that was really a jab at him. He prepared meticulously, adding the dye to the pool at the exact concentration, keeping the water clear to the naked eye. He installed extra cameras, their lenses hidden among the shrubs, and staged his exit Saturday morning, driving off as Linda watched from her porch. But he parked around the corner, slipped back through a side gate, and settled into his home office, phone ready to record. At 2 p.m., Linda arrived, 6 friends in tow, all decked out in designer swimsuits and carrying champagne. "Ladies, welcome to our Saturday sanctuary," she declared, raising a glass. "What the new guy doesn't know won't hurt him." They slathered on their pricey sunscreen, the kind James had tested, and dove in, laughing and splashing, oblivious to the reaction brewing. It started with Susan, a petite woman with a high-pitched voice. "Linda, is your skin green?" she gasped, staring at her arm. Linda looked down, shrieked, and chaos erupted. Their skin turned a bright, unmistakable green, streaking down their faces with their makeup. "My son's graduation is tomorrow," one wailed, scrambling out. Linda, dripping and furious, spotted a camera's blinking light and realized she'd been caught. The exodus was a spectacle, 6 green-tinted women sprinting through the neighborhood, leaving wet footprints on the sidewalk. James edited the footage with clips of Linda's prior trespassing, set it to their jazz music, and posted it online. It went viral, dubbed "Linda Goes Green," with millions of views. Her insurance firm distanced itself, the neighborhood turned on her, and her green-tinged apology video only fueled the fire. She sold her house and moved, while James's pool became a community hub, a symbol of standing firm with dignity. A year later, as James floated in his pool, he smiled at an email. Linda was now hassling someone else's golf course. Karma, it seemed, always made a splash. The neighborhood thrived, his pool parties a weekly event, and the peace he'd fought for was finally his. This was his home, his sanctuary, and no one, not Linda Harris, not anyone, was going to take that from him. Little did he know, the battle for that peace was only just beginning. The next few days passed uneventfully, though James couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He'd catch glimpses of Linda through her second-floor window, her silhouette framed against the glass as she peered down at his yard, phone pressed to her ear. He told himself it was paranoia, a holdover from years of scanning dark alleys for threats, but the unease lingered. He busied himself with settling in, unpacking boxes, hanging framed photos of his parents and his old precinct crew, and tinkering with the pool's filtration system to ensure it ran smoothly. The house was still a work in progress, its rooms echoing with the promise of a life yet to be fully lived, but the backyard was his pride. He'd spent hours cleaning the pool, skimming leaves and balancing the chemicals until the water sparkled like glass. It was his retreat, a place where he could shed the weight of his past and simply be. That illusion shattered one afternoon when his phone buzzed with an alert from the security camera he'd installed at the back gate. He'd set up the system the day after moving in, a precaution born of habit rather than necessity, or so he'd thought. Opening the app, he saw Linda strolling through the gate, a glass of lemonade in hand, her flip-flops clacking against the stone path. She paused by the pool, glancing around as if inspecting her domain, then plopped down on one of his chairs, dipping her feet into the water with a contented sigh. James was at the hardware store, picking up paint for the guest room, but he watched the live feed with a growing sense of disbelief. She didn't even hesitate, didn't look over her shoulder, just made herself at home. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his jaw was set, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. He stepped out, the bag of paint cans clinking in his arms, and marched to the backyard. Linda was still there, reclining with her eyes closed, the lemonade glass now empty beside her. The sight of her, so brazenly comfortable on his property, sent a surge of irritation through him, but he kept his voice level. "What are you doing here?" he asked, setting the bags down with a deliberate thud. Linda's eyes snapped open, and she sat up, feigning surprise with a hand to her chest. "Oh, James, you startled me," she said, her tone syrupy. "I just wanted to make sure the pool was being taken care of. It'd be a shame if it went to waste." He crossed his arms, staring her down. "I told you before, this is my property. You don't have permission to be here. Get out." She rolled her eyes, standing with exaggerated slowness, as if his request were a minor inconvenience. "No need to be so dramatic," she said, brushing imaginary dust from her swimsuit. "I'm just being neighborly." She sauntered toward the gate, pausing to glance back at him. "You really should lighten up, you know. This neighborhood's all about community." James didn't respond, watching until she was out of sight. The word community lingered in his mind, twisted by her smug delivery into something hollow. He knew what she meant, that he didn't fit her idea of who belonged here. It wasn't the first time he'd faced that sentiment, and it wouldn't be the last. But this was his home now, and he wasn't about to let her dictate its rules. That evening, as he sat in his living room with a beer, the incident replayed in his head. He pulled up the camera footage, saving it to a folder on his laptop labeled Linda. It was a habit from his police days: document everything, build a case, be prepared. He didn't know what she'd do next, but he had a feeling this was only the start. The pool, still and silent under the moonlight streaming through his window, seemed to mock him with its promise of peace. He took a long sip, the cold liquid soothing his throat, and resolved to keep his eyes open. Linda Harris had thrown down a gauntlet, and James Washington wasn't one to back away from a fight. Her next move came sooner than he expected. One Saturday morning, he awoke to the sound of laughter and splashing water, a cacophony that pierced the quiet of his bedroom. He rubbed sleep from his eyes, pulled on a t-shirt, and stepped onto his balcony, peering down at the backyard. His stomach dropped. Linda was there, hosting a full-blown pool party on his property. 5 women lounged around the pool, their designer swimsuits gleaming in the sun, a spread of snacks and wine bottles scattered across his patio table. A Bluetooth speaker blared smooth jazz, the notes drifting up to him like an insult. They laughed and chatted, their voices carrying over the water, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing. James stood frozen for a moment, disbelief warring with anger. He'd dealt with bold criminals in his time, but this level of audacity was something else. He took a deep breath, counting to 10 as he'd been trained, then headed downstairs. Grabbing his phone, he opened the camera app to record as he stepped outside, his bare feet cool against the stone path. The women didn't notice him at first, too caught up in their revelry, but Linda's head snapped up as he approached, her smile faltering. "Everyone, get out now," he said, his voice low and commanding, the tone he'd used to break up bar fights and calm volatile scenes. "This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here." Linda set her wine glass down, standing with a dismissive wave. "Oh, James, don't make a fuss. We're just having a little fun. This pool's been sitting here unused since you moved in. Why be so selfish?" One of her friends, a brunette with dangling earrings that caught the light, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Linda. "You said you had permission," she muttered, starting to gather her things. The others hesitated, their laughter dying down, but Linda pressed on, her voice rising. "Go ahead, call the cops if you want. I know everyone at the station. My husband golfs with the chief." James didn't flinch, his gaze locked on her. He'd heard threats like that before, empty boasts from people who thought connections trumped consequences. "I don't need to call anyone yet," he said, holding up his phone, the red recording light blinking. "But I've got this. Leave, or I'll make sure the right people see it." The brunette stood, tugging at Linda's arm. "Come on, let's go," she whispered, her eyes darting to James. The others followed, gathering their bags and towels with hurried movements, their earlier confidence evaporating. Linda lingered, her face flushed with defiance, but she finally relented, storming out last. "This isn't over," she hissed as she passed him, her voice a venomous promise. James watched them go, the gate slamming shut behind them. He stopped the recording, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and frustration. The pool was a mess, empty glasses, crumbs scattered across the table, a towel left floating in the water. He sank into a chair, running a hand over his face, and replayed her words in his mind. "This isn't over." He knew she meant it, and he knew he'd have to be ready. The peace he'd come here for was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a brewing storm he couldn't ignore. That afternoon, he drove to the hardware store, picking up extra locks for the gate and a few more security cameras. If Linda wanted a war, he'd fight it his way, with evidence, patience, and the law on his side. He spent the evening installing the cameras, their small lenses glinting like sentinels around his property. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of crimson, he stood by the pool, the water still rippling from the day's chaos. He wasn't just protecting a house anymore, he was defending his dream, his right to belong. And he'd be damned if he let Linda Harris take that from him. The weeks that followed were a slow escalation, a game of cat and mouse that tested James's resolve. His cameras caught Linda in action again and again, sneaking through the gate at dusk, testing the locks with an old key she must have gotten from the previous owners, peering through his windows with a sly smirk. One night, he watched the footage of her pouring a bottle of lemon extract into his pool, the sharp citrus scent hitting him the next morning when he went to check the water. It wasn't enough to ruin the system, but it was a petty jab, a message that she could reach him whenever she pleased. He confronted her once more, catching her red-handed as she lingered by the pool with a glass of wine. "I've got you on camera," he said, holding up his phone. "This stops now, or I'm pressing charges." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Go ahead. No one's going to care about a little neighborly visit. You're the outsider here, not me."